"Hey, old man, don't break a hip with that mop." The words cut through the morning air like broken glass. Tommy Parker's smirk was razor-sharp, his friends snickering behind him as the old janitor just kept working, kept quiet, like he always did. But here's the thing about heroes. They don't always wear the uniforms you expect. Sometimes they wear silence. Sometimes they carry secrets heavier than any medal. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single salute can shatter every assumption you've ever made. Because when Colonel Harris walked into that hallway and snapped his hand to attention, every laugh died in their throats. Every breath caught. And suddenly, everyone realized the man they'd mocked had carried more honor in his weathered hands than they could ever imagine. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And if you believe respect is earned through sacrifice, not status, smash that subscribe button. You're not going to want to miss what happens next. November mornings in Brooksville, Georgia hit different. The kind of cold that creeps into your bones and makes you pull your jacket tighter, makes every breath come out in little puffs of mist. At Brooksville High School, 15 miles from the gates of Fort Liberty, that military heartbeat still echoed through the small town streets. 3 generations of fathers and sons had worn the uniform. It was in the DNA of the place. The school buzzed with pre-Veterans Day energy. Streamers hung from every doorway, red, white, and blue, twisted, together like little promises. Hand-painted posters lined the walls. Thank you for your service. Land of the free because of the brave. The kind of patriotic display that looked good for the cameras, but felt hollow in the fluorescent light. Most kids rushed past it all, earbuds in, lost in their own worlds. But in the middle of that chaos, Jack Turner moved like he was invisible. 72 years old, shoulders still square despite the weight of decades. His custodian's uniform was that particular shade of blue that spoke of budget meetings and practical decisions, faded at the elbows, name tag worn smooth by countless washings. He pushed his mop bucket down the main hallway, wheels squeaking, a rhythm that had become the school's heartbeat. Squeak, roll, pause. Squeak, roll, pause. Jack had a way of noticing what others missed. A piece of tape coming loose on a poster, he'd smooth it down. A flag pin that had tilted sideways, he'd straighten it with careful fingers. A wrapper someone had dropped. Into his pocket it went, to be thrown away properly later. These weren't his assigned duties. Hell, most days people forgot he existed, but Jack Turner had learned long ago that service wasn't about recognition. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Jack worked in that quiet space before the storm of teenage energy fully erupted. He wiped down smudged glass, adjusted a crooked poster near the entrance, gathered the papers that seemed to multiply overnight in empty classrooms. His left leg caught the light wrong as he moved. A slight favor that spoke of old injuries. The kind that remember even when you'd rather they didn't. Most people didn't notice, but Lena Williams did. Lena taught history in room 142, 28 years old, with the kind of observant eyes that caught details others missed. She'd been at Brooksville High for 2 years now, long enough to know the rhythm of the place, short enough to still notice the things that had become invisible to everyone else. Like the way Jack Turner moved with a precision that seemed out of place for a custodian, the way he stood when he thought no one was looking, shoulders back, chin up like he was still reporting for duty somewhere, the way his hands were always gentle with the American flag displays, like he was handling something sacred. She'd asked him once, catching him as he adjusted a loose screw on her classroom door. "Mr. Turner, were you ever in the service?" Jack had paused, his weathered hands still for just a moment. His blue-grey eyes had looked somewhere far beyond the bright hallway, past the buzz of overhead lights, into a place she couldn't follow. "Long time ago," he'd said softly. Then he'd turned back to the door, and the moment was gone. But Lena remembered the weight in those 3 words, the way they carried decades of unspoken stories. That's why her heart clenched now as she watched from her doorway, because she could see what was coming. Tommy Parker owned the hallways of Brooksville High the way his father owned half the town. Senior class president, starting quarterback, the kind of golden boy who'd never met a mirror he didn't like. His Letterman jacket was pristine, every letter perfectly stitched, every pin polished to shine. He moved through the school like he had inherited it, and, in a way, he had. His father's dealership sponsored the football team. His mother served on the school board. The Parker name was carved into half the trophy cases in the building. Tommy wore that legacy like armor, and it made him dangerous in the casual way that privilege always is. He leaned against the lockers now, surrounded by his usual crew: Josh Martinez, Eric Chen, and Malik Davidson. All varsity jackets and easy laughter, all blessed with the particular cruelty that comes from never having to face consequences. "Look at old Turner," Tommy said, his voice carrying that false sweetness that always preceded something ugly. "Man's been here since before dirt was invented." The boys laughed, but it wasn't kind laughter. It was the sound sharks make when they smell blood in the water. Jack continued his work, methodical and patient. He emptied trash cans with the same care he'd shown for everything else, lifting each bag gently, tying it off properly, replacing the liner with hospital corners. Small acts of care that kept the world functioning, invisible and unappreciated. Tommy's eyes tracked Jack's movements, calculating. There was something about the old man's quiet dignity that grated against Tommy's need to be the center of attention. Maybe it was the way Jack never looked impressed by the varsity jackets or the family names. Maybe it was the way he moved through the school like he belonged here, had earned his place here, without needing to announce it to anyone. "Hey, old man," Tommy called out, his voice slicing through the morning chatter like a blade. Jack paused. His hand rested on the mop handle, knuckles white against the worn wood. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not fear, but something deeper. Something that recognized the tone of voice, the setup, the inevitable. Cruelty that was coming. "Don't break a hip with that mop. We'd hate to have to clean up after you." The laughter that followed was sharp and mean, the kind that cuts because it's meant to. A few other students slowed their pace, sensing drama. Some pulled out phones because nothing existed anymore unless it was recorded. Jack didn't flinch, didn't react. He just stood there, absorbing it all with the steady patience of a man who had learned to weather storms much worse than teenage cruelty. Lena's jaw tightened from her doorway. She wanted to step in, to say something, but the moment felt balanced, on a knife's edge. Sometimes interference only made things worse. Jack met Tommy's eyes for just a second, long enough for the boy to see something that made him uncomfortable. There was no fear there, no embarrassment, just a steady, measuring look from eyes that had seen things Tommy couldn't imagine. "Bet you've been here since the Cold War, huh, Mr. Turner?" Tommy pressed, emboldened by his audience. "Should have retired." With the dinosaurs, more laughter, more phones pointing in their direction, Jack simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that could have meant anything, and went back to his mopping. He moved the cloth in long, even strokes, cleaning the same spot he'd cleaned 100 times before. But something had shifted in the hallway. Lena felt it, even if she couldn't name it. The way Jack held his shoulders, the careful control in his movements, the sense that they were all standing on the edge of something none of them understood. Tommy wasn't done. He never was when he had an audience. "You know what?" Tommy said, pushing off from the lockers. "I think old Turner here needs some encouragement. It's Veterans Day, after all. Maybe we should give him a salute." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Tommy's friends shifted uncomfortably. Even they could sense that something was about to cross a line. But before Tommy could move, before the moment could spiral into something uglier, the side door opened. A figure stepped through, tall, straight-backed, wearing the kind of bearing that only comes from decades of command. Colonel Michael Harris retired, but carrying his authority like it was welded to his bones. The morning sun caught the Silver Eagle insignia on his shoulder, and every eye in the hallway turned toward him. The colonel's gaze swept the scene. The kids with their phones, the boy in the letterman jacket, the old custodian with his mop. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he took in the tableau, and something in his expression made the entire hallway go quiet. His eyes found Jack Turner, and recognition flashed across his features like lightning. Not the casual recognition of seeing someone familiar, but something deeper, something that reached back across decades and half a world away. Colonel Harris's right hand moved without hesitation. Up it went, fingers straight and strong, forming a salute so crisp and precise it could have cut glass. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of absolute authority. "Staff Sergeant Jack Turner," he said, each word ringing clear in the sudden silence. "With respect, sir." The hallway didn't just go quiet, it went dead. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to stop humming. Tommy's smirk died on his lips like someone had switched off a light. His friends stood frozen, phones forgotten. In their hands, Lena Williams felt her heart stop and restart in her chest. She'd known there was more to Jack Turner, but this was beyond anything she'd imagined. Jack stood perfectly still for a long moment, the mop handle steady in his weathered hands. Then slowly, his chin lifted, his shoulders squared, and for just an instant, the elderly custodian disappeared, replaced by the soldier he'd once been. The transformation was subtle but complete, like watching a man remember who he really was. He didn't return the salute. Couldn't, with the mop in his hands. But his eyes met the colonel's across the space between them, and something passed. There that needed no words. "Colonel Harris," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that none of the students had ever heard before. "Been a long time." The colonel held his salute for another moment, then lowered his hand with military precision. "Not long enough to forget," he said. "Never long enough for that." Tommy Parker felt the world tilt under his feet. The easy certainty of his place in the hierarchy, the comfortable knowledge that he could pick his targets without consequence. All of it crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "I don't," he started, then stopped. For the first time in his 17 years, Tommy Parker didn't know what to say. Colonel Harris turned his attention to the boy, and his expression was neither harsh nor kind. It was simply implacable. The look of a man who had seen real consequences and wasn't impressed by high school theatrics. "What's your name, son?" the colonel asked. Tommy Parker." The words came out smaller than Tommy intended. "Tommy Parker," the colonel repeated like he was filing it away for future reference. "Tell me something, Tommy. What do you know about Vietnam?" Tommy's mouth opened and closed. We studied it in history class." "Did you study Khe Sanh?" The colonel's voice was conversational, but there was steel underneath. "January 1968. 77 days of siege, outnumbered, outgunned, cut off from resupply." The hallway had become an amphitheater, every student and teacher hanging on the colonel's words. "I was a second lieutenant," Harris continued. "Green as grass, scared out of my mind, and certain I was going to die in that red dirt. The North Vietnamese had us zeroed in. Mortars, rockets, sniper fire. Every trip to the latrine was a coin flip with death." He paused, his eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "February 14th, the bombardment was so heavy we couldn't lift our heads. That's when the probing attack started. They were testing our defenses, looking for weak spots. I was manning a position on the perimeter when shrapnel from a rocket caught me in the leg and shoulder. Couldn't move, couldn't fight, bleeding into the mud. Lena found she was holding her breath. Other teachers had gathered in doorways, drawn by the tension in the air. That's when Staff Sergeant Turner found me, the colonel said, his voice softening with memory. Crawled 50 yards through machine gun fire to reach my position. dragged me back to the aid station while mortars fell around us like rain, saved my life." Tommy's face had gone pale. The easy arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "This man," Colonel Harris said, gesturing toward Jack, "carried me through hell so that I could come home, so that I could have a career, a family, a life, and you want to mock him because he pushes a mop?" The silence stretched like a held breath. Jack Turner stood perfectly still, his eyes distant. This wasn't his story to tell, had never been his story to tell. He'd carried it quietly for 50 years, another burden among many. "I didn't know," Tommy whispered. "No," the colonel agreed. "You didn't. But that's not an excuse, son. That's the problem." He turned to address the broader crowd that had gathered. "Let me tell you all something about heroes," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "They don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear coveralls. Sometimes they carry mops instead of rifles. But they never stop serving." Jack shifted, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. He'd spent so many years being invisible that the spotlight felt foreign, overwhelming. "Staff Sergeant Turner didn't just save my life in Vietnam," the colonel continued. "He mentored younger soldiers, led patrols through hostile territory, earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire. When he came home, he could have demanded recognition, could have parlayed his service into a comfortable job and a comfortable life. The colonel's eyes found Jack's. Instead, he chose to serve quietly, to keep this school running, to make sure you kids had a clean, safe place to learn. Every door he's fixed, every floor he's mopped, every small repair he's made, that's service too. That's love of country in action." Tommy's hands were shaking now. The weight of his own cruelty was pressing down on him like a physical thing. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Turner, I'm so sorry." Jack looked at the boy for a long moment. Tommy expected anger, expected judgment. Instead, he saw only a deep, weary kindness. "It's all right, son," Jack said quietly. "You know now. That's what matters." But Colonel Harris wasn't finished. "No," he said firmly, "it's not all right, and it's not enough to just know better." He stepped closer to Tommy, close enough that the boy could see the lines around his eyes, the weight of decades in his bearing. "You want to know what honor looks like?" the colonel asked. "It looks like showing up every day, even when no one notices. It looks like doing the right thing when there's no audience, no applause, no recognition. It looks like treating every person you meet with the respect they deserve as a human being." Tommy nodded, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Turner has been teaching you that lesson every day for years," the colonel continued. "You just weren't paying attention." The crowd had grown as word spread through the school. Students filled the hallway, pressed against doorways, straining to hear. This wasn't the Veterans Day assembly they'd been expecting, but it was the one they needed. Jack Turner stood at the center of it all, still holding his mop, still wearing his faded blue uniform. But something had changed in the way people looked. At him, the invisibility was gone, replaced by a recognition that felt both overwhelming and long overdue. Principal Reynolds appeared at the edge of the crowd, drawn by the commotion. His face cycled through confusion, alarm, and finally a kind of awed respect as he pieced together what was happening. "Mr. Turner," he said, pushing through the crowd. "I had no idea. The school, we should have known." Jack's smile was tired, but genuine. "Wasn't anything that needed knowing," he said. "Just doing my job." "No, sir," Colonel Harris interjected. "You've been doing far more than your job. You've been setting an example, teaching lessons about service and sacrifice that no textbook could ever capture." He turned to the principal. "Mr. Reynolds, I'd like to make a request. Tomorrow's Veterans Day assembly. I want Staff Sergeant Turner seated in the place of honor. I want every student in this school to understand what they've had walking among them all these years. Principal Reynolds nodded eagerly. Of course. Absolutely. Mr. Turner, would you be our guest of honor? Jack hesitated. Decades of staying in the shadows, of avoiding attention, of keeping his service quietly to himself, it all pushed against the idea of stepping into the spotlight. But then he looked at the faces around him, at Lena Williams, whose eyes were bright with tears, at Tommy Parker, whose world had just been turned upside down in the best possible way, at the other students, seeing him truly for the first time. "I'd be honored," he said simply. The applause started slowly, a single pair of hands clapping, then another, until the entire hallway rang with it. Not the polite, obligatory applause of a school assembly, but something real and heartfelt and overdue. Tommy was the first to step forward. His face was streaked with tears, his usual swagger completely gone. "Mr. Turner," he said, his voice shaking, "I want to apologize, not just for today, but for all of it. For not seeing you, for not respecting you, for being—" He struggled, and for the words. For being the kind of person who would mock a hero. Jack's weathered hand reached out and rested on Tommy's shoulder. "You're not that person," Jack said gently. "You're the person who's learning to do better. That's all any of us can do." Colonel Harris watched the exchange with approval. This was what leadership looked like. Not the demand for respect, but the quiet earning of it. Not the destruction of those who had wronged you, but the patient teaching of better ways. Other students began to approach, shy at first, then with growing confidence. They wanted to shake Jack's hand, to thank him, to somehow make up for years of looking through him like he wasn't there. Lena Williams finally stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Turner," she said, "I teach history. I spend every day trying to make the past real for these kids, trying to help them understand the sacrifices that were made so they could be here. And all this time, that history was walking right beside them in the hallway." Jack's eyes met hers. "History isn't about the past, Miss Williams," he said quietly. "It's about what we choose to do right now, in this moment. These kids just made some history of their own." The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly. The magic of the moment was fragile, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. But classes needed to continue, and life had to go on. As the hallway cleared, Jack found himself alone with Colonel Harris and his mop bucket. The two men looked at each other across 5 decades of shared memory. "You never told anyone," the colonel said. "It wasn't a question. Wasn't my story to tell," Jack replied. "Besides, what happened over there, that was just soldiers doing their job. What happened here today, that's these kids learning how to be better people. That's the real victory, Colonel." Harris nodded slowly. "You always were the wisest man in any room, Sergeant." "Just the oldest," Jack said with a slight smile. "No," the colonel said firmly. "The wisest. You understood something the rest of us took years to figure out. That the real war isn't fought with bullets and bombs. It's fought in moments like this, in choices about how we treat each other, in decisions about what kind of people we want to be." Jack picked up his mop bucket, the wheels squeaking in their familiar rhythm. But the sound meant something different. Now, it wasn't the sound of invisibility anymore. It was the sound of service acknowledged, of sacrifice recognized, of a quiet hero finally seen. "Tomorrow's going to be different," Colonel Harris observed. "Tomorrow's always different," Jack replied. "Question is whether it's different in a good way or a bad way. I think these kids are going to surprise us." He was right. When Veterans Day dawned bright and clear, when the assembly filled the auditorium with red, white, and blue, when staff, Sergeant Jack Turner took his place in the front row, the applause that greeted him wasn't just polite recognition. It was love. It was gratitude. It was the sound of a community finally understanding what had been walking among them all along. And in the back of the auditorium, Tommy Parker sat with his friends, and learned what it meant to respect not just the uniform, but the person who had worn it. Not just the soldier, but the man who had never stopped serving. Some heroes never ask to be remembered, but sometimes, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, the world finds a way to say thank you. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. Watty, do you think about quiet heroes who serve without recognition? Have you ever met someone whose true story was hidden beneath an ordinary job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to Legacy Valor, because every veteran has a story, and every story deserves to be told. Hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.